Let's step back from Ed Gein specifically and look at what his story represents philosophically. The psychology of the outsider, the alienated, the isolated. This isn't just about one man in Wisconsin. It's about a fundamental human vulnerability. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about existence preceding essence, the idea that we're not born with fixed identities. We create ourselves through choices, through actions, through relationships. But what happens when you have no relationships? When there are no mirrors to show you who you're becoming? Your essence, your identity, doesn't form normally. You exist, but you don't cohere. You become, in Sartre's terms, radically free. But freedom without structure isn't liberation. It's terror, formlessness, the inability to navigate reality because you have no fixed point. Ed Gein existed in this state. After his mother died, he had no social relationships to reflect identity back to him. No structure, no boundaries, no feedback telling him when he'd crossed lines, because those lines are socially constructed. They require other people to maintain them. Albert Camus explored similar themes: the absurd, the recognition that life has no inherent meaning. Most people cope through connection, through creating meaning together, through shared reality. But what happens when you're completely alone, when there's no shared reality, no consensus about what matters? Camus said we must imagine Sisyphus happy, finding meaning in the struggle itself, even without purpose. But that requires a kind of philosophical strength, an ability to create meaning alone. Ed Gein didn't have that strength. He had dependency, programming, the voice of his mother replacing his own thoughts. When she died, he wasn't free. He was unmoored, lost, grasping for any structure. And the only structure he knew was her. So he tried to maintain her presence through whatever fractured means his broken mind could conceive. This is the psychology of the outsider taken to its extreme. Not romantic isolation, not chosen solitude, not the artist alone in their studio creating meaning, but pathological isolation. The kind that doesn't build character, it destroys it. Modern psychology understands this better now. We know that social isolation is as dangerous as smoking, that loneliness kills, not metaphorically, literally, through stress, through depression, through the deterioration of both mind and body. But we also know something else. That isolation doesn't just harm, it distorts. It changes how you perceive reality, how you process information, how you relate to other humans. Studies on solitary confinement show that even short periods of complete isolation can cause hallucinations, paranoia, loss of emotional regulation. Now imagine a lifetime, not in a cell, in a farmhouse, with one controlling relationship, then none. What happens to empathy? The ability to recognize others as fully human with their own experiences and rights. Empathy develops through diverse social interaction, through seeing yourself in others, through theory of mind, understanding that other people have internal lives as complex as your own. Without social interaction, empathy doesn't develop normally, or it atrophies. Others become less real, less fully human, more like objects, or obstacles or resources. This is dehumanization, not through ideology, through deprivation. When you're isolated long enough, other people stop feeling real. They become abstractions, characters, means to an end rather than ends in themselves. This is what happened to Ed Gein's mind, not because he was born without empathy, but because isolation eroded it, year after year, decade after decade, until other people weren't fully real anymore, until boundaries that should be absolute between person and object, living and dead, became negotiable. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas wrote about the face of the other, the idea that when you truly see another person, their face, their humanity, you're confronted with infinite responsibility. You can't harm them, because their face reveals their vulnerability, their humanity, their demand to be treated as a person. But what if you never learn to see the face of the other? What if isolation means you never develop that recognition? then others remain abstractions, and abstract beings can be used, manipulated, treated as objects. This isn't evil in the traditional sense, it's absence, the absence of the development that makes morality possible. Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil, not dramatic wickedness, just the absence of thought, the inability to see from another's perspective. Ed Gein wasn't a philosophical villain. He was a case study in what happens when normal moral development never occurs, when isolation and control prevent the formation of the very faculties that make ethical behavior possible. This is why his story matters beyond true crime, beyond horror films, because it reveals how fragile our humanity is, how dependent on constant social reinforcement. We like to think morality is inherent, that we're born knowing right from wrong. But we're not. We learn it. Through relationships, through feedback, through seeing ourselves reflected in the humanity of others. Remove those relationships and morality doesn't just weaken, it dissolves, not into active evil, into emptiness, into the inability to navigate ethical reality because the framework for doing so was never built. This is the lesson, not about Ed Gein specifically, about isolation, about disconnection, about what we risk when we allow people to fall through the cracks, when loneliness becomes pathological and we look away, when mental illness goes untreated because of stigma or lack of resources, when someone's entire social world shrinks to nothing and nobody intervenes, because the consequences aren't just individual suffering. They're the dissolution of the very capacities that make us human. Empathy, connection, the ability to see others as fully real. These aren't luxuries, they're necessities, not just for happiness, for humanity itself.